Lady Analia Whitford possessed everything society deemed valuable: beauty, wealth, and suitors queuing at her door like merchants at market. Yet she chose to love the one man in all of England who had nothing left to offer except the ruins of his ancestral home and a heart that had been broken by betrayal, scandal, and the crushing weight of inherited shame. The autumn rain drummed against the cracked windows of Rowan Manor as Duke Sebastian Rowan stood in what had once been the grandest ballroom in all of Yorkshire, now a hollow shell where wallpaper peeled like ancient skin and chandeliers hung dark and dusty, their crystals long since sold to pay creditors who circled his estate like vultures, waiting for the final breath of a dying beast. At 31, Sebastian possessed the kind of aristocratic handsomeness that should have made him the toast of London society, tall and lean, with dark auburn hair that caught fire in candlelight, emerald green eyes that held depths of intelligence and pain in equal measure, and the refined features of centuries of noble breeding. Yet his title, once among the most respected in England, had become a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms about the dangers of trusting the wrong people and the speed with which fortune could abandon even the most ancient of bloodlines. "Your Grace?" His aging butler Hartwell appeared in the doorway with the careful dignity of a man who had served the Rowan family for 40 years and refused to abandon his post despite months of unpaid wages. "There is a lady to see you, Lady Analia Whitford. She says it's a matter of some urgency." Sebastian felt his heart skip a beat at the mention of her name, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Lady Analia Whitford, the woman who had somehow managed to capture his attention, and against all reason and propriety, his heart, during the brief period when he still moved in polite society before the full extent of his financial ruin became public knowledge. She was everything he was not: wealthy, sought after, surrounded by admirers who could offer her the kind of life that a duke should provide, but that he could no longer even dream of giving. "Show her to the library," Sebastian said quietly, running a hand through his hair as he tried to imagine what could possibly bring her to his crumbling estate. "And Hartwell, try to ensure the fire is lit and the room looks as presentable as possible." "Of course, Your Grace." As Sebastian made his way through corridors lined with empty frames where family portraits had once hung, sold along with most of the valuable furnishings to keep creditors at bay, he tried to prepare himself for what was surely going to be a painful encounter. Perhaps she had come to gently but firmly end whatever understanding had existed between them, to make it clear that a woman of her standing could not possibly associate with a man whose reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed by the actions of his late father and the business partner who had systematically embezzled the family fortune before disappearing into the night. The library, one of the few rooms in the manor that still retained some semblance of its former grandeur, thanks to the books being too heavy and numerous for creditors to bother removing, felt warm and welcoming after Hartwell's ministrations. A fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls, and someone had managed to find a few pieces of decent furniture that hadn't yet been claimed by debt collectors. When Lady Analia entered the room, Sebastian felt his breath catch in his throat as it always did when he saw her. At 23, she possessed a beauty that was both striking and unconventional by the standards of English society. Her skin was a warm, rich brown that spoke to distant ancestors from warmer climes, inherited through her grandmother, who had been the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner in the Caribbean. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style that emphasized the graceful line of her neck, and her eyes were a warm amber that seemed to hold flecks of gold when the light caught them just right. She wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy wool that complemented her complexion beautifully and spoke to the wealth and status that made her one of the most sought-after young women in England. "Lady Analia," Sebastian said, offering a bow that he hoped conveyed the proper respect despite the informal setting. "This is unexpected. I hope you haven't travelled far in this weather." "From London," she replied, her voice carrying the cultured tones of the aristocracy, but with an underlying warmth that had always set her apart from the cold calculation that characterized so many of her peers. "Sebastian, we need to talk." The use of his given name sent a thrill through him, though he tried to maintain his composure. "Of course, please sit. Can I offer you some tea? I'm afraid our hospitality is not what it once was, but—" "Sebastian, stop," Analia said firmly, moving closer to where he stood by the fireplace. "Stop apologizing for circumstances that were never your fault. Stop acting as though you're somehow less worthy of respect because of what your father and that dreadful man did to your family's fortune. Sebastian stared at her in amazement, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. Analia, you don't understand. My reputation, my financial situation. I have nothing to offer anyone, least of all someone like you. Someone like me? She challenged, her amber eyes flashing with something that might have been anger. What exactly do you mean by that? I mean someone with wealth, with options, with suitors who can offer you the kind of life you deserve, Sebastian said, his voice rough with emotion. Analia, look around you. This house is falling apart. I can barely afford to keep the roof from leaking, let alone provide the kind of luxury that someone of your station expects. And you think that matters to me? Analia asked, stepping even closer until she was close enough to reach out and touch his face if she chose to. Sebastian, do you really believe I'm so shallow, so mercenary, that I would choose a husband based solely on the size of his bank account? It's not about being shallow, Sebastian replied, though his resolve was weakening under the intensity of her gaze. It's about being practical. Marriage is a partnership, and what kind of partner would I be if I couldn't even provide basic security? The kind who would love me for who I am, rather than what I can bring to the arrangement, Analia said softly, her voice carrying a conviction that made Sebastian's heart race. Sebastian, I didn't travel through a storm to Yorkshire to discuss financial portfolios. I came because I needed to tell you something that I should have said months ago. What is that? Sebastian asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. That I love you, she said simply, her amber eyes never wavering from his face. I love you, Sebastian Rowan. Not your title, not your estate, not your bank account. I love the man who spent an entire evening at the Pemberton Ball talking to me about books instead of trying to impress me with his connections. I love the man who helped that elderly woman find her carriage in the rain without caring that his own clothes were ruined. I love the man who has faced scandal and financial ruin with dignity and grace, who has never once blamed others for circumstances beyond his control. Sebastian felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Analia, you can't. That is, your family will never accept. They've already made it clear that they expect you to marry someone who can enhance your social position, not someone who would be seen as a step down. My family doesn't get to choose who I love, Analia said firmly. Sebastian, I'm not a child to be married off for political advantage. I'm a woman with my own fortune, my own mind and my own heart, and my heart has chosen you. But the scandal, the gossip, the way society will treat you if you associate with me, will be their problem, not mine, Analia interrupted. Sebastian, I've spent my entire life being told what I should want, who I should marry, how I should behave. For once, I want to choose something for myself, and I choose you. Sebastian stared at her for a long moment, his emerald eyes searching her face for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. What he found instead was a determination and sincerity that took his breath away. Analia, he said softly, reaching out to take her hands in his. I love you too. I've loved you since that first evening when you laughed at my terrible joke about Gothic novels, and then proceeded to demonstrate that you knew far more about literature than half the men at Oxford. But loving you and being able to offer you the life you deserve are two very different things. What if I told you that I don't need you to offer me anything except your love? Analia asked. What if I told you that I have enough money for both of us, and that I would rather live in this crumbling old house with you than in the grandest palace with someone I didn't love? I would say that you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met, Sebastian replied, his voice thick with emotion. And I would ask if you're absolutely certain that this is what you want, because once we take this step, there will be no going back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Analia said, her amber eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. Sebastian, will you marry me? The question hung in the air between them, revolutionary in its boldness and beautiful in its simplicity. Sebastian felt his heart soar as he realized that this remarkable woman was offering him not just her love, but a future he had never dared to dream possible. Yes, he whispered, pulling her into his arms with a passion that spoke to months of suppressed longing. Yes, my brave, beautiful, impossible woman. Yes, I will marry you. As they kissed in the firelight of the old library, surrounded by the remnants of past glory and the promise of future happiness, both Sebastian and Analia understood that they were embarking on a love story that would challenge every convention society held dear. But they also knew that what they had found in each other was worth any price they might have to pay for the privilege of choosing love over expectation, heart over fortune, and each other over the approval of a world that had never understood the true value of either of them. The opposition. The news of Lady Analia Whitford's engagement to the ruined Duke of Rohan spread through London society like wildfire, igniting a scandal that had the ton buzzing with speculation, outrage, and fascination in equal measure. The announcement, published in the Morning Post, with all the dignity that proper breeding demanded, was met with reactions ranging from shocked disbelief to barely concealed glee from those who delighted in seeing the mighty fall. At Whitford House in Mayfair, the reaction was far from celebratory. "Have you completely taken leave of your senses?" Lord Whitford thundered as he paced the length of his study, his face red with apoplectic fury. "Analia, this is madness. The Duke of Rohan is a penniless scandal, a man whose family name has been dragged through every gutter in London." Analia sat in the chair opposite his desk with perfect composure, her hands folded in her lap and her expression serene despite the storm raging around her. "Father, I understand your concerns, but my decision is final. I love Sebastian, and he loves me. That is all that matters." "Love?" Lady Whitford interjected from her position by the window, her voice dripping with disdain. "Analia, you are 23 years old, quite old enough to understand that love is a luxury that women in our position cannot afford. Marriage is about alliance, about securing one's future, about advancing the family's interests." "And what about my interests, Mama?" Analia asked quietly. "What about my happiness? Am I to sacrifice that for the sake of social advancement?" "Your happiness will come from security, from respect, from knowing that you have made a match that benefits not just yourself but your entire family," Lady Whitford replied sharply. "The Duke of Rohan can offer you none of those things. He is a broken man with a broken estate and a reputation in tatters." "He is a good man who has faced adversity with dignity and grace," Analia countered, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "The scandal that destroyed his fortune was not of his making. His father was deceived by a business partner who embezzled their money and disappeared. Sebastian has done nothing wrong except inherit the consequences of other people's crimes." "The why of it doesn't matter," Lord Whitford said coldly. "The fact remains that he is ruined, and association with him will ruin you as well. Analia, I have worked my entire life to build this family's reputation and fortune. I will not stand by and watch you throw it all away for some romantic notion." "Then perhaps it's time you understood that your daughter is not your property to be disposed of as you see fit," Analia said, rising from her chair with a grace that belied the steel in her voice. "I am of age, I have my own fortune from grandmother's inheritance, and I will marry whom I choose." The mention of her inheritance, a substantial sum left to her by her maternal grandmother, who had shared Analia's independent spirit, caused both her parents to pale with understanding. Unlike most young women of her class, Analia was not entirely dependent on her family's approval for her financial security. "Analia, please," Lady Whitford said, her tone shifting from anger to pleading. "Think of what you're doing. Think of the doors that will close to you, the invitations that will stop coming, the way society will whisper about you behind their fans. Is this man really worth becoming a social pariah?" "He is worth everything to me," Analia replied simply. "Mama, Papa, I know you love me and want what you believe is best for me. But what's best for me is not a loveless marriage to a man who sees me as nothing more than a profitable alliance. What's best for me is a life with someone who values me for who I am, not what I can bring to the arrangement. And when his creditors come calling, when the roof caves in on that mouldering pile he calls an estate, when you're forced to live in genteel poverty while your former friends cross the street to avoid acknowledging you," Lord Whitford demanded. "Then we'll face those challenges together," Analia said with quiet dignity. "Father, you taught me that true character is revealed not in times of prosperity, but in how one handles adversity. Sebastian has shown more character in the face of ruin than most men show when everything is going their way." The argument continued for hours, with her parents alternately pleading, threatening, and attempting to reason with their stubborn daughter. They brought up every possible objection: the social consequences, the financial implications, the damage to the family's reputation, the certainty that she would regret her decision once the romance wore off and reality set in. But Analia remained unmoved, her resolve only strengthening with each attempt to dissuade her. She had found something precious and rare in her relationship with Sebastian, a love that was based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than calculation and convenience. She was not about to sacrifice that for the approval of a society that valued wealth over worth and status over sincerity. "Very well," Lord Whitford said finally, his voice cold with finality. "If you insist on this madness, Analia, then you do so without our blessing or support. You will not be welcome in this house as long as you persist in this foolish attachment." The words hit Analia like a physical blow, but she kept her expression composed, even as her heart broke at the thought of losing her family. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Father. I had hoped that you would come to understand that my happiness matters more than social convention." "Your happiness is a luxury we cannot afford," Lady Whitford said, tears streaming down her face. "Analia, please, I'm begging you, reconsider this decision before it's too late." "It's already too late, Mama," Analia said softly. "I've already given my heart, and I won't take it back to satisfy other people's expectations." As Analia left Whitford House that evening, her belongings packed and her future uncertain, she felt a mixture of grief and liberation. She was losing her family, at least temporarily, but she was gaining something far more precious: the chance to build a life based on love rather than obligation, choice rather than expectation. The carriage ride back to Yorkshire felt like a journey into an uncertain but hopeful future. She was returning to a man who loved her for who she was, to a crumbling estate that they would restore together, to a life that would be challenging but authentic. As the lights of London faded behind her, Analia felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made her choice, and despite the pain of her family's rejection, she knew it was the right one. Love, she had discovered, was indeed worth any price she might have to pay for it. Building together, Sebastian was waiting for her when the carriage pulled up to Rowan Manor in the early hours of the morning, his tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the open doorway. Despite the late hour and the emotional toll of her confrontation with her family, Analia felt her heart lift at the sight of him, this man who had somehow become her anchor in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. "How did it go?" he asked gently as he helped her down from the carriage, though the expression on her face already told him everything he needed to know. "About as well as we expected," Analia replied, allowing herself to lean into his strength for a moment. "They've disowned me, at least for now. But Sebastian, I don't regret it. I can't regret choosing you." Sebastian pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he could shield her from all the pain and uncertainty that lay ahead. "I'm sorry, my love. I know how much your family means to you. If there were any way I could spare you this, there isn't, and that's not your fault," Analia said firmly, pulling back to look into his emerald eyes. "Sebastian, we both knew this wouldn't be easy, but I'd rather face difficulties with you than live comfortably without you." Over the following weeks, Analia threw herself into the task of making Rowan Manor not just habitable, but beautiful again. Armed with her inheritance and a determination that impressed even the most skeptical of the remaining servants, she began the slow process of restoration that would transform the crumbling estate into something approaching its former glory. "The roof in the east wing needs complete replacement," she told Sebastian one morning as they walked through the manor with a master builder she had summoned from York. "And we'll need to address the foundation issues in the library before the winter rains make them worse." Sebastian watched in amazement as his bride-to-be took charge of renovations with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. She had a natural eye for design and an intuitive understanding of what the house needed to regain its dignity without bankrupting them in the process. "Analia, are you certain about this?" he asked one evening as they reviewed the mounting costs of the restoration. "This is a substantial investment, and there's no guarantee that we'll be able to recoup it if what? If our marriage fails. If you decide you don't love me after all?" Analia challenged, though her tone was gentle rather than accusatory. "If I prove to be as poor a husband as I was a steward of my family's fortune," Sebastian said quietly, his voice heavy with self-doubt. Analia set down the papers she had been reviewing and moved to where he stood by the window, taking his hands in hers with the same gentle firmness she had shown throughout their courtship. "Sebastian, listen to me," she said, her amber eyes serious and intent. "You were not responsible for your father's poor judgment or his business partner's theft. You inherited a disaster that was not of your making, and you have handled it with more grace and dignity than most men would have managed. But the debts, the scandal, the way society has turned against our family, are temporary setbacks, not permanent judgments on your character. Analia interrupted. Sebastian, I'm not investing in this house because I think it will make us rich. I'm investing in it because it's our home, because it represents our future together, because I believe that what we're building here is worth preserving. And what exactly are we building? Sebastian asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand. A life based on love rather than calculation, partnership rather than dominance, hope rather than fear, Analia replied. We're building something that society says is impossible, a marriage that succeeds not because of what the parties bring to it financially, but because of what they bring to it emotionally. As the restoration progressed, Sebastian began to see not just the physical transformation of his ancestral home, but his own transformation from a man defeated by circumstances to one empowered by love and partnership. Analia's unwavering faith in him, her practical approach to their challenges, and her refusal to be daunted by either society's disapproval or the magnitude of the task they had undertaken gradually restored his confidence in himself and their future. You know, he told her one evening as they sat in the newly restored library, surrounded by books that had been cleaned and reorganized, furniture that had been repaired and reupholstered, and walls that had been replastered and painted, I think this room looks better now than it ever did when I was growing up. That's because it was restored with love instead of obligation, Analia replied, curled up in the chair beside his with a book in her lap and a contented smile on her face. Everything is more beautiful when it's cared for by people who choose to be there. Their wedding took place on a crisp December morning in the small church that served the village near Rowan Manor. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the handful of local friends who had remained loyal to Sebastian through his troubles and the servants who had come to love and respect their new mistress. Analia wore a gown of ivory silk that she had designed herself, elegant in its simplicity and perfectly suited to both the setting and her own natural beauty. As they exchanged vows in the ancient church where generations of Rowans had been married, Sebastian felt a profound sense of gratitude for the extraordinary woman who had chosen to link her fate with his. She could have had any man in England, wealthy, titled, socially prominent men who could have offered her a life of ease and luxury. Instead, she had chosen him, with all his flaws and failures and financial limitations. I promise to love you not just in prosperity, but in adversity. Not just when things are easy, but when they're difficult. Not just when society approves, but when it disapproves, he said, as he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. All he could afford, but chosen with infinite care. And I promise to stand by you through whatever challenges we face, to believe in you when you doubt yourself, to remind you of your worth when the world tries to convince you that you have none, Analia replied, her voice strong and clear, despite the tears of joy that sparkled in her amber eyes. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian kissed his bride with a passion that spoke to all the love, gratitude, and hope that filled his heart. They were no longer just two people who had found each other against all odds. They were partners, allies, and soulmates ready to face whatever the future might bring. Society's judgment. The newlyweds' first test came sooner than expected, in the form of an invitation to the Christmas ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough, one of the most prestigious social events of the London season. The invitation was addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Rowan, a formal acknowledgement of their marriage that surprised both Sebastian and Analia. Do you think it's genuine, or are they simply curious to see the spectacle of the ruined Duke and his unconventional bride? Sebastian asked, as he studied the elegant invitation, his emerald eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and wariness. Does it matter? Analia replied, looking up from her correspondence with a calm smile. Sebastian, we can't spend our entire marriage hiding from society or second-guessing every invitation we receive. At some point, we need to show the world that we're not ashamed of our choices. But the gossip, the stares, the way they'll dissect every aspect of our appearance and behavior. We'll say more about them than about us, Analia said firmly. My love, I didn't marry you to hide away in Yorkshire for the rest of our lives. I married you because I believe that what we have together is beautiful and worth celebrating. Let them stare, let them whisper. We know the truth of our marriage, and that's all that matters. The journey to London was undertaken with careful preparation. Analia had commissioned new gowns from the finest modiste in York, ensuring that her appearance would be beyond reproach, while Sebastian had his formal wear meticulously tailored to disguise the fact that it was several years old. They travelled in a hired carriage rather than their own, a small economy that spoke to their changed circumstances, but one they bore with dignity. Their arrival at Marlborough House was met with the kind of attention usually reserved for visiting royalty or notorious criminals. As their carriage pulled up to the grand entrance, Analea could see curious faces pressed to windows and hear the buzz of speculation that followed their progress up the marble steps. "Remember," she whispered to Sebastian as they paused in the receiving line, "we have nothing to apologize for. We are here as equals, not as supplicants seeking approval." The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough received them with polite courtesy that revealed nothing of their true feelings about the controversial couple. Their greeting was correct but cool, acknowledging their titles while maintaining the kind of distance that spoke volumes about their position in society's current estimation. Your Grace," the Duchess of Marlborough said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How delightful to see you both. I trust your journey from Yorkshire was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," Analea replied with perfect composure. "Your home is as magnificent as ever. Thank you for including us in your celebration." As they entered the ballroom, Analea felt the weight of hundreds of curious stares, heard the whispered conversations that paused as they passed and resumed with renewed intensity once they had moved on. She kept her head high and her expression serene, her hand resting lightly on Sebastian's arm in a gesture that spoke of unity and mutual support. "Well, well," came a familiar voice from behind them. "If it isn't the Duke and Duchess of Rohan, how unexpected to see you in London." They turned to find Lord Pemberton approaching with his wife, both wearing expressions of barely concealed malicious curiosity. Lord Pemberton had been one of Sebastian's father's contemporaries, and his tone suggested that he was relishing the opportunity to witness the fallen Duke's social discomfort. "Lord Pemberton, Lady Pemberton," Sebastian replied with cool politeness. "I trust you are both well." "Oh, we're quite well, thank you," Lady Pemberton said with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Though I must say, we were all quite surprised to hear of your marriage. Such an unusual match, given the circumstances." "Unusual in what way?" Analea asked, her voice carrying a subtle challenge that made several nearby conversations pause. "Well, my dear," Lady Pemberton said, clearly relishing the opportunity to be cruel, "one doesn't often see a young woman of your advantages choosing to marry a man in such reduced circumstances. It's quite romantic, I suppose, in a Gothic novel sort of way." The insult was delivered with such sweet venom that several people nearby gasped audibly. The implication was clear, that Analea had either been deceived about Sebastian's circumstances or had made a foolish romantic choice that she would soon regret. "How kind of you to be concerned about my romantic choices," Analea replied with a smile that was both gracious and deadly. "Though I must confess, I find it curious that you would describe love as something from a Gothic novel. Perhaps that says more about your own experience of marriage than mine." The comeback was delivered with such perfect composure and subtle wit that several people nearby actually chuckled, while Lady Pemberton's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. I merely meant," Lady Pemberton stammered. "I'm sure you meant to be kind," Analea said smoothly, her amber eyes sparkling with amusement. "After all, what could be more wonderful than finding someone who loves you for who you are, rather than what you possess? I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate in that regard." Sebastian watched his wife handle the social ambush with a mixture of pride and amazement. Where he had expected to spend the evening defending their choices and deflecting criticism, Analea was turning every attack into an opportunity to demonstrate the strength and authenticity of their relationship. "Indeed," he said, finding his voice and his confidence returning under her influence. "I am the fortunate one, Lord Pemberton. To have found a woman who values character over fortune, substance over superficiality, well, it's more than most men dare hope for." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with the Pembertons becoming increasingly flustered as their attempts at social cruelty were deflected with grace and wit. When they finally excused themselves, clearly having failed to achieve their goal of humiliating the couple, several other guests approached with expressions of genuine interest rather than malicious curiosity. "Your Grace," an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a distinguished bearing approached them. "Lord Ashworth, I knew your father, Sebastian, and I wanted to tell you how sorry I was to hear of your family's difficulties, but I also wanted to say how impressed I am with the dignity you've shown throughout this ordeal." "Thank you, my lord," Sebastian replied, genuinely touched by the unexpected kindness. "And you, my dear," Lord Ashworth continued, turning to Analea with a warm smile, are to be commended for seeing past society's shallow judgments to the man beneath. It takes courage to follow one's heart when the world is watching and waiting for you to fail. Thank you, Lord Ashworth, Analia said, her voice warm with genuine gratitude. Though I must say I don't consider myself particularly courageous. I simply married the man I love. It seems like the most natural thing in the world. As the evening progressed, a curious thing happened. While there were certainly those who whispered behind fans and made cutting remarks about the ruined Duke and his naive bride, there were also many who found themselves charmed by the couple's obvious affection for each other and impressed by their grace under pressure. When the dancing began, Sebastian led Analia onto the floor with a confidence that surprised even himself. They moved together with a harmony that spoke to their deep connection, their eyes never leaving each other's faces as they swept across the polished marble. "Look at them," one young lady whispered to her companion as they watched from the sidelines. "Have you ever seen two people more obviously in love?" "It's rather romantic, isn't it?" her friend replied. "To think that she chose him despite everything, and that he was brave enough to let her." By the end of the evening, Sebastian and Analia had achieved something remarkable. They had not just survived their first major social test, they had triumphed. They had shown society that their marriage was not a desperate alliance or a romantic folly, but a genuine partnership built on love, respect, and mutual support. As they prepared to leave, the Duke of Marlborough approached them personally, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the other guests. "Rowan," he said, extending his hand in a gesture of respect, "I wanted to tell you that you and your Duchess have conducted yourselves with remarkable dignity this evening. You are welcome in my home any time." The public endorsement from one of society's most influential figures was worth more than any amount of money could have purchased. As word of the Duke of Marlborough's approval spread through the ballroom, Sebastian and Analia felt the social tide beginning to turn in their favor. "We did it," Sebastian whispered to his wife as their carriage pulled away from Marlborough House. "We did," Analia agreed, leaning against his shoulder with a satisfied smile. "Though I must admit, I rather enjoyed watching Lady Pemberton's face when she realized her little barbs weren't landing as intended." "You were magnificent," Sebastian said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I've never been prouder to call someone my wife." Reconciliation and growth. The success of their appearance at the Marlborough Ball marked a turning point in both their social standing and their personal confidence. Invitations began arriving with increasing frequency, and Sebastian found himself being approached by former friends and business associates who had previously avoided him. More importantly, their obvious happiness and the strength of their partnership began to change the narrative surrounding their marriage from one of scandal to one of romance. It was during this period of gradual social rehabilitation that an unexpected visitor arrived at Rowan Manor, Lord Whitford, Analia's father, looking older and more subdued than when she had last seen him. "Papa," Analia said, her voice carefully controlled, as Hartwell showed him into the morning room where she and Sebastian were taking breakfast. "This is unexpected." "Analia," Lord Whitford said, his voice heavy with emotion. "My dear girl, I've come to apologize. To both of you." Sebastian rose from his chair, his expression wary but polite. "Lord Whitford, please sit. Can we offer you some tea?" "Thank you," the older man said, taking the offered seat with the careful movements of someone who had aged considerably in the months since their last meeting. I've been hearing things about your marriage, about how happy you are, about the way you've conducted yourselves in society. And," Analia asked, though her tone had softened slightly at the sight of her father's obvious distress, "and I realized that I was wrong," Lord Whitford said, his voice breaking slightly. "Analia, I was so focused on what I thought you should want, on what I believed would make you secure and respectable, that I failed to see what would actually make you happy." He turned to Sebastian, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and respect. "Your Grace, I owe you an apology as well. I judged you based on circumstances beyond your control, and I failed to see the man my daughter fell in love with. From everything I've heard, you have proven yourself to be exactly the kind of husband she deserves, honorable, devoted, and worthy of her love." Sebastian exchanged a glance with Analia, seeing in her amber eyes the same mixture of hope and caution that he felt himself. "Lord Whitford, I appreciate your words, but what matters most to me is Analia's happiness. If you're here to try to convince her to leave me—" "No," Lord Whitford said quickly. "No, quite the opposite. I'm here to ask if there's any chance that you might forgive a foolish old man who let pride and convention blind him to his daughter's happiness. I'm here to ask if I might have my daughter back." Analia felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw emotion in her father's voice. Despite everything that had passed between them, he was still her father, and she had missed him terribly. "Papa," she said softly, moving to kneel beside his chair and taking his hands in hers. "Of course you can have your daughter back. I never wanted to lose you. I just couldn't sacrifice my happiness for your approval. And I should never have asked you to," Lord Whitford said, his voice thick with tears. "Analia, I've spent these months watching other families, seeing marriages that were made for all the right social reasons, but lack any real affection or respect. I realized that what you have with Sebastian is infinitely more valuable than anything I was trying to push you toward." The reconciliation with her father marked the beginning of a new chapter in Analia's life. Within weeks, Lady Whitford had also arrived at Rowan Manor, tearful and apologetic, begging forgiveness for her part in the estrangement. The reunion of the family, while emotional and sometimes difficult, ultimately strengthened the bonds between them and provided Sebastian with the family acceptance he had never dared to hope for. "You know," Lord Whitford told Sebastian one evening as they shared brandy in the restored library, "I've been thinking about your situation with the estate. I have some connections in the business world, people who might be interested in investment opportunities with the right kind of management." Sebastian looked up from his glass with surprise. "Lord Whitford, I appreciate the thought, but I couldn't accept charity." "It wouldn't be charity," the older man interrupted. "Sebastian, you have something that many investors would value: integrity, intelligence, and the kind of determination that comes from having faced real adversity. What you lack is capital, and that's something that can be provided by the right partners. What exactly are you proposing?" "A business partnership. You provide the land, the oversight, and the management. My associates and I provide the capital for development, agricultural improvements, perhaps some light manufacturing, maybe even some of the new railway investments that are proving so profitable. We share the profits according to our contributions." Sebastian stared at his father-in-law with amazement. "You would do that? After everything that's happened? After the scandal? Sebastian, you're my son-in-law now, and more importantly, you're the man who makes my daughter happy," Lord Whitford said firmly. "But beyond that, you're a good investment. I've been watching how you've handled your difficulties, how you've managed to maintain your dignity and your principles, even when everything was falling apart around you. That's the kind of character that succeeds in business, given the right opportunities." The business partnership that resulted from this conversation proved to be exactly what Sebastian needed to restore not just his financial position, but his confidence in his own abilities. Within a year, the investments in agricultural improvements and railway development had begun to pay dividends, and Rowan Manor was not just restored, but thriving. More importantly, Sebastian discovered that he had a natural talent for business that had been suppressed by years of focusing on social obligations and family tradition. Working with Lord Whitford and his associates, he developed new approaches to estate management that became models for other landowners facing similar challenges. "You know," Analia told him one evening as they walked through the gardens that had been restored to their former glory and beyond, "I think losing everything might have been the best thing that ever happened to you." "How can you say that?" Sebastian asked, though his tone was more curious than offended. "Because it forced you to discover who you really are," Analia explained. "When you had everything handed to you, you never had to test your own capabilities. When you lost it all, you discovered that you're actually quite brilliant at creating wealth rather than just inheriting it. And it brought me you," Sebastian added, pulling her into his arms with the easy affection that had become second nature to them. "If I had still been the wealthy, respectable Duke of Rowan, you might never have looked twice at me." "Oh, I don't know about that," Analia said with a mischievous smile. "You were always rather handsome, and you did make me laugh with that terrible joke about Gothic novels." "It was not a terrible joke," Sebastian protested with mock indignation. "It was absolutely dreadful," Analia laughed. "But it was also charming, because you were so pleased with yourself for making it. That's when I knew you were different from all the other men who were trying to impress me with their wealth and connections." The legacy of love. 3 years after their wedding, Sebastian and Analia had not only restored Rowan Manor to its former glory, but had transformed it into something even more magnificent. A home filled with love, laughter, and the kind of warmth that came from a marriage built on genuine partnership and mutual respect. The estate itself had become a model of progressive management, with Sebastian's innovative approaches to agriculture and industry attracting visitors from across England who wanted to learn from his success. The irony was not lost on either of them that the man who had once been considered a failure was now sought out for his expertise and vision. But perhaps the greatest transformation was in Sebastian himself. The defeated, bitter man, who had once seen himself as nothing more than the inheritor of other people's mistakes, had become a confident, successful businessman who understood that true wealth came not from what one inherited, but from what one created. "I have news," Analia announced one morning, as they sat in the breakfast room, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over gardens that bloomed with the promise of spring. "Good news or interesting news?" Sebastian asked, looking up from the correspondence that had arrived with the morning post. "Wonderful news," Analia said, her amber eyes sparkling with joy. "Sebastian, we're going to have a baby." Sebastian stared at her for a moment, the words taking time to penetrate his consciousness. Then his face broke into a smile so radiant that it transformed his entire appearance. "A baby?" he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Analia, are you certain?" "Quite certain," she laughed, rising from her chair to move into his arms. "Doctor, Morrison confirmed it yesterday. We're going to be parents, Sebastian." Sebastian held her close, his heart overflowing with a joy so complete that he felt as though he might burst from the sheer magnitude of it. A child, their child, a living symbol of the love that had transformed both their lives. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I love you so much, Analia. Thank you for giving me everything I never dared to dream I could have." "Thank you for showing me what real love looks like," Analia replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "Sebastian, when I first told my parents I was going to marry you, they asked me if I was prepared to live in poverty for love. What they didn't understand was that loving you has made me the richest woman in England." The months that followed brought a happiness so complete that both Sebastian and Analia sometimes had to pinch themselves to believe it was real. The baby, when he arrived on a crisp October morning, was a perfect combination of both parents, Sebastian's emerald eyes and Analia's warm brown skin, creating a child of extraordinary beauty who would grow up understanding that love was indeed the greatest treasure of all. "What shall we call him?" Sebastian asked as he held his son for the first time, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features. "William," Analia said without hesitation. "William Rowan. A strong name for a boy who will grow up knowing that true strength comes from love, not from wealth or title." As Sebastian looked down at his son, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a broken man, with nothing to offer except a crumbling house and a heart full of shame. Now he was a successful businessman, a beloved husband, and a father, surrounded by family and friends who valued him for who he was rather than what he possessed. "You know," he said to Analia as they sat together in the nursery they had prepared with such love and anticipation, "I used to think that losing my fortune was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I realize it was the best thing, because it led me to you. And I used to think that defying my parents was the most frightening thing I could do," Analia replied, her amber eyes soft with contentment as she watched their son sleep peacefully in his father's arms. "Now I know it was the bravest thing, because it led me to the life I was meant to live." 5 years later, the gardens of Rowan Manor were in full bloom on the morning of Sebastian and Analia's 5th wedding anniversary, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the grounds as 4-year-old William chased his 2-year-old sister Margaret through the maze of flower beds that had been designed specifically for their enjoyment. Sebastian stood on the terrace watching his children play, marveling at how completely his life had been transformed by the love of one extraordinary woman. At 36, he was no longer the bitter, defeated man who had once stood in these same gardens contemplating the ruins of his family's legacy. He was a successful businessman, a devoted husband, and a loving father who had learned that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with the richness of one's relationships. "Penny for your thoughts?" Analia said, coming up beside him and slipping her hand into his with the easy familiarity of a couple who had grown even closer with time. "I was thinking about how grateful I am," Sebastian replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "For you, for our children, for this life we've built together." "Analia, 5 years ago, I thought my story was over. I never imagined it was just beginning. Our story, Analia corrected gently. Sebastian, what we have isn't just your story or my story. It's our story, and it's far from over. As they stood together watching their children play in the gardens that had been restored with love and determination, both Sebastian and Analia understood that they had created something far more valuable than financial security or social acceptance. They had proven that love could indeed triumph over every obstacle that society and circumstance could place in its path. "Mama! Papa!" William called out as he ran toward them, his emerald eyes bright with excitement and his dark hair tousled from play. "Look what Margaret found." Their daughter toddled behind her older brother, clutching a butterfly that had apparently been willing to rest on her small hand. Margaret was a perfect blend of both parents, with Sebastian's aristocratic features softened by Analia's warm coloring and gentle nature. "How beautiful, sweetheart," Analia said, kneeling down to admire the butterfly that seemed perfectly content to remain perched on her daughter's finger. "But I think it wants to fly back to its family now." Margaret carefully opened her hand, and they all watched as the butterfly took flight, dancing through the air before disappearing among the roses that bloomed in abundance throughout the restored gardens. "Papa," William said, tugging on Sebastian's coat with the persistence that only a 4-year-old could manage, "tell us the story again, about how you and Mama fell in love." Sebastian exchanged an amused glance with Analia. Their son had developed a fascination with what he called the love story, and frequently requested retellings of how his parents had met and married, despite all the obstacles in their path. "Well," Sebastian said, settling onto one of the garden benches and pulling both children onto his lap, while Analia sat beside them, "once upon a time, there was a duke who thought he had lost everything that mattered." "Because the bad man took all his money?" William asked, already knowing the story by heart, but delighting in hearing it again. "That's right," Sebastian confirmed. "And the Duke was very sad because he thought that without money, no one could ever love him. But then Mama came," Margaret chimed in, clapping her small hands together with delight. "Yes, then Mama came," Analia said, her voice warm with the memory of that stormy day when she had travelled to Yorkshire to declare her love. "And she told the Duke that she didn't care about money or what other people thought. She cared about him. And they got married and lived happily ever after," William concluded with satisfaction. "Not quite yet," Sebastian said with a smile. "First they had to be very brave and face all the people who said they were wrong to love each other. They had to prove that love was stronger than money, stronger than what other people thought, stronger than fear." "And were they brave?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "They were very brave," Analia said, reaching over to smooth her daughter's hair. "And because they were brave, they got to have the most wonderful life together, with a beautiful house and a lovely family." "With us," William said proudly. "With you," Sebastian agreed, hugging both children close. "You are the very best part of our happily ever after." As the afternoon wore on and the children eventually tired themselves out with play, Sebastian and Analia found themselves alone on the terrace as the sun began to set over the estate that had become so much more than either had ever dared to dream. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been brave enough to come to Yorkshire that day?" Analia asked, leaning against Sebastian's shoulder as they watched the last light fade from the sky. "I try not to think about it," Sebastian replied with a slight shudder. "I probably would have spent the rest of my life convinced that I was worthless, that I had nothing to offer anyone. I might never have discovered that I actually had talents and abilities that went far beyond what I inherited. And I would have spent my life married to someone I didn't love, wondering what it would feel like to have a marriage based on genuine affection rather than social convenience," Analia added. "Sebastian, do you realize that by choosing each other, we didn't just find love, we found ourselves?" "I know exactly what you mean," Sebastian said, turning to face her fully. "Analia, you didn't just save me from financial ruin or social disgrace. You saved me from becoming a bitter, defeated man who had given up on the possibility of happiness. You showed me that I was worth loving, worth fighting for, worth believing in. And you showed me that I was strong enough to defy convention, brave enough to follow my heart, and wise enough to recognize true worth when I found it," Analia replied. "Sebastian, I think we were both lost before we found each other. You had lost your sense of purpose, and I had lost my sense of self. Together, we found both." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of what they had built together through love, determination, and unwavering faith in each other, both Sebastian and Analia felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their love story had begun with what seemed like an impossible situation: a ruined duke with nothing to offer and a wealthy young woman who was expected to marry for advantage rather than affection. Society had predicted failure, her family had predicted disaster, and even Sebastian himself had believed that he was too damaged and too poor to deserve someone like Analia. But they had proven that love, when it was genuine and when it was supported by mutual respect, shared values and unwavering commitment, could overcome any obstacle. They had shown that true wealth was not measured in gold or property, but in the richness of one's relationships and the depth of one's connections with others. "You know," Sebastian said, as they finally rose to go inside, "I think our children are going to grow up with a very different understanding of what makes a successful marriage than either of us had." "How so?" "They're going to grow up seeing two people who chose each other freely, who support each other through difficulties, who respect each other's opinions and abilities, and who genuinely enjoy each other's company," Sebastian explained. "They're going to expect love in their marriages because they've seen what real love looks like. And they're going to understand that true security comes not from wealth or status, but from being with someone who values you for who you are rather than what you can provide," Analia added. "Sebastian, I think we're raising the next generation to be braver and wiser than we were." As they entered the house that had been transformed from a symbol of failure into a testament to the power of love and determination, Sebastian and Analia felt a deep sense of satisfaction in what they had accomplished. They had not just restored a building or rebuilt a fortune, they had created a legacy that would influence their children and their children's children for generations to come. Their story had become a beacon of hope for others who faced similar challenges. Proof that love could indeed triumph over circumstance when it was supported by courage, commitment, and the willingness to work together toward a common goal. They had shown that the most beautiful love stories often began with the most unlikely circumstances, and that true happiness came not from having everything handed to you, but from building something meaningful with someone who shared your values and your dreams. The ruined duke and the brave young woman who had chosen to love him had created something far more valuable than any inheritance or dowry could ever provide. They had created a partnership that would stand as an example of what marriage could be when it was based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the kind of love that grew stronger with each challenge it faced. As Sebastian extinguished the lamps in the library, where they had first begun to truly know each other, he reflected on how completely his life had been transformed by one woman's courage to follow her heart, despite all the voices telling her to choose security over love. Analia had not just married a ruined duke. She had married a man who had the potential to become something far greater than his circumstances suggested, and her faith in him had made that transformation possible. "What are you thinking about?" Analia asked, as they climbed the stairs to their chambers, her hand warm in his, as it had been every night for the past 5 years. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself," Sebastian replied. "Analia, you didn't just fall in love with a ruined duke. You fell in love with the man I could become, and your love made that transformation possible. And you showed me that I was strong enough to defy every expectation society had for me, brave enough to choose my own path, and wise enough to recognize that the greatest riches in life have nothing to do with money," Analia replied as they reached their door. "Sebastian, we saved each other, and in doing so, we created something beautiful that will last far beyond our own lives." As they settled into bed together, surrounded by the comfort and security they had built through their own efforts, and sustained by their unwavering love for each other, both Sebastian and Analia understood that they had achieved something remarkable. They had proven that love was indeed the greatest treasure of all, and that when two people were willing to fight for each other and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring, there was no obstacle they could not overcome together. Their love story had begun with a ruined duke who thought he had nothing to offer, and a brave young woman who saw beyond surface circumstances to the man beneath. It had flourished through trials and triumphs, through social opposition and family reconciliation, through financial struggle and eventual prosperity. And it would continue to grow and strengthen with each passing year, a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over the approval of a world that had never understood the true value of either of them. In the end, Sebastian and Analia had discovered that the greatest wealth was not gold or property or social position, but the richness of a life shared with someone who loved you completely and unconditionally. They had learned that true nobility came not from birth or title, but from the courage to follow one's heart and the wisdom to recognize that love, when it was real and true, was worth any price one might have to pay for it. Their story would be told for generations. The tale of the ruined duke and the brave young woman who proved that love could indeed conquer all, and that the most beautiful endings often came from the most unlikely beginnings. They had created a legacy that would inspire others to be brave enough to choose love over convenience, to believe in the possibility of happiness even when circumstances seemed impossible, and to understand that the greatest riches in life were those that could never be bought or sold, only earned through the courage to love and be loved in return. Their love story became a beacon of hope that illuminated the truth that genuine worth is measured not in gold or status, but in the courage to love authentically and the wisdom to recognize that true wealth lies in the connections we forge with others. Duke Sebastian Rowan and Lady Analia proved that when two hearts are willing to be vulnerable, to take risks, and to believe in the possibility of happiness despite all obstacles, even the most impossible circumstances can give birth to the most extraordinary love. Their union showed the world that true nobility comes not from birth or wealth, but from the strength to overcome adversity, the wisdom to see beyond surface circumstances, and the courage to choose love over fear, proving that the most beautiful love stories are those built on the foundation of mutual respect, unwavering commitment, and the revolutionary belief that love is indeed the greatest treasure of all.